Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Anna Warner. She is an assistant professor in the Anthropology department at the University of Colorado, Denver. Her research focuses on the evolution of the human musculoskeletal system using biomechanical techniques to assess how variation in physical structure affects locomotor performance. She is specifically interested in the human pelvis and how its unique anatomy impacts both locomotion and human birth. So, Dr. Warner, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to everyone.
Thanks. I appreciate you asking me to join you.
Yeah, sure. So, okay, let's talk a little bit then about our locomotion and how it evolved and so on. So, uh, what were some of the main steps we took in our evolutionary history in terms of our anatomy since we departed from our last common ancestor with chimps and bonobos?
Yeah, obviously, being a biped walking on 2 feet is unique amongst primates. A lot of primates will sort of occasionally stand up and walk on their hind limbs to carry things, but no other primate is an obligate biped, meaning that that's the only way they get around. And so our shared last common ancestor with chimpanzees and bonobos was probably somewhere between 6 and 7 million years ago, and we have some fossil evidence from right around that time period that seems to suggest that aspects of the thigh bone are starting to look more human-like and certainly suggesting bipedal locomotion. The fossil evidence is we never get the perfect bones that we want out of the ground to tell us with great certainty, but it suggests that at that early point in time bipedalism is becoming more important in our hominin evolutionary history. By somewhere around 4.5 million years ago, we have species or genera like Ardipithecus that are showing us a pelvis that looks as though it is adapted for bipedal locomotion, and other aspects of the lower limb that show those same functional traits. But we see a lot of characteristics that indicate still a lot of arboreal locomotion. So, at that point in time, probably some mixture of bipedalism when on the ground, but a lot of arboreal behavior. And then as we move through the next, million to 1.5 million years, we start to see with species like Australopithecus pelvis and lower limb that look much more human-like than what we had seen before. So, the pelvic shape of Australopithecus, it's distinctive from humans in that it generally is pretty wide. Our pelvis that are really important for muscles that are needed to stabilize your body when you're walking on 2 feet. Those are all present, and also aspects of the thigh bone and the shin bone and the foot, all indicating that bipedal locomotion is pretty well developed at that point. And then, of course, as we move into the genus Homo, we start to see changes in limb proportion. So lower limbs get longer, upper limbs, particularly the forearms, start to get shorter. And so that begins to indicate that bipedalism by that point is kind of the main mode of locomotion. Australopithecus, there's still some indication of arboreal behavior, but certainly by the time we get to the genus Homo, we're seeing hominins that walk probably essentially exactly as we walk and run at this point. So yeah, so that's kind of the evolutionary trajectory.
Right. And do we know exactly when we moved from a mostly arboreal species to a mostly terrestrial one?
So I no, because
Yeah.
interpreting, I would certainly say, that genus I mentioned, Ardipithecus, there are a large number of physical characteristics that look like they're important for arboreal behavior. And while we see bipedalism becoming maybe more important, it's probably not the I don't know how you partition in a fossil assemblage how much time they spent doing this versus how much time they spent doing that, because we don't have the benefit of our time machine, unfortunately. I'd say by the time, we're getting to 3.5 to 3 million years ago, bipedalism is probably more dominant, and arboreal behavior may be used more for specific tasks like feeding or sleeping, to get away from potential predator threats on the ground. But in terms of moving across the landscape, bipedalism would have been the way to do it.
Yeah. So, and what does our pelvis has to do with our bipedalism? I mean, what kind of changes have had to happen for us to become an exclusively bipedal species?
Yeah, so that's interesting. I don't know if your viewers have an image of what their pelvis looks like, but it's kind of this, bowl-shaped structure, and the top part of your pelvis, there's these broad blades, and they're called iliac blades, and people that's what when they say they're hip bones, that's sort of what you're touching, is that part of that fan-shaped blade. And in particular, if you look at like the pelvis of a chimpanzee or most other quadrupeds, somewhat similar, those iliac blades tend to be really, really tall and narrow, and they're oriented in a way so that the blade has a front surface and a back surface. Yep. But in humans, those blades have rotated to move around to the side, and they've gotten broader, so they have broader attachments for muscles. And one of the really key points about that rotation occurring is that it takes muscles that were once facing the back of the body and puts them on the side of the body. And those are the minor gluteal muscles. And so in a quadrupedal animal, those minor gluteal muscles are helping extend the leg or push the leg backwards. So when the animal pushes off, it's part of the extensor mechanism. But when you wrap the pelvis around like this, and those muscles are now on the side of the body, they act to abduct the leg, so they lift your leg out to the side. And the reason that that's important is that every time that you step, the leg that you are stepping on requires that you engage those hip abductors, because if you don't, your pelvis will drop away from your standing leg. And I always refer to this as like the model catwalk, where, when they walk and their pelvis does this very extreme, tilt from side to side. It may work really well on a catwalk, but it's not actually like a great way to maximize, your locomotion when you're walking down the street. And so those hip abductors have to be contracting to level out your pelvis and keep your center of mass from bouncing up and down with every step. And so that's a really important functional change. And when we start to see that broadening of the iliac blades and the wrapping of those iliac blades, that's a really good key indicator that bipedalism is becoming important. So one of the ways that we know that species like Ardipithecus ramidus were probably bipeds is because we start to see that change in the upper pelvis. The lower part of the pelvis has important adaptations too, but we see those occurring later in the fossil record. So like your sits bones, where the bony part of your bottom that touches your seat when you're sitting, those are called your ischial tuberosities. And in a quadruped, they tend to be more tucked underneath. But in humans, they stick out a little bit more backwards. They face more towards the back of the body, and that gives them better leverage for the hip extensor muscles. And that change isn't present in Ardipithecus ramidus, but it is present as we start moving through the fossil record, more so in Australopithecus, but certainly by the time we get to the genus Homo. So the changes in the upper pelvis we see really early, and the changes in the lower pelvis sort of lag behind that, and that is probably related to this continuation of arboreal behavior through a lot of hominin evolution until we get to our genus. So, yeah, so those are the basic shape differences.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so I didn't write down this question, but I would like to ask you, do we know, perhaps not exactly, but do we have any idea of what might have been the evolutionary pressures that led to the evolution of human bipedalism?
That is very much debated. So there have
Yeah,
been
I know.
lots, yeah. So there have been lots and lots of different theories. And of course, the theories are dependent on the clarity of our understanding of the environment in which specific hominins lived. And of course, that has changed over time too. So, you know, whatever 30 or 40 years ago, the idea of the opening of the savanna was really important, and explanations about why humans became bipedal. Now we realize that that opening lagged far behind the actual adoption of bipedal locomotion in hominids, so we need some other explanation. And I think the two sort of competing the two competing ideas have to do with what did body form look like in that last common ancestor shared between humans and chimps. And one idea is that body form looked very much chimp-like. And the idea behind that would be, you know, I mean, chimps engage in sort of a lot of climbing and suspensory behavior. And when they're on the ground, they're knuckle walking, and their back is sort of, you know, slightly more lifted or upright. It's not completely parallel to the ground because they have such long front arms. And so that basic body form is still persistent in living chimpanzees, and it is also present in bonobos. So it makes sense to infer that the last common ancestor between us looked something like that. However, there's increasing evidence that maybe the last common ancestor shared between our lineages was more of sort of an upright arborealist. So more similar to something like an orangutan that is kind of moving bipedally in the trees, but using hands for support. And that's for some reason that became advantageous on the ground. And there's some interesting fossils that are, you know, suggestive of that. And so that's a separate model. And I'd say right now, those are kind of the two competing models of body form. And then what you have to do is make assessments about what would be the environmental conditions that would facilitate or make, you know, changes from those body forms advantageous in the hominin lineage. And in truth, we don't have a good answer for that question yet. So that's kind of where things are.
Yeah, fair enough. But let me just break that down a little bit, because I've heard some hypotheses out there, and I just wanted to know if any of them still make sense or not. So I've heard, for example, that when we moved from the rainforest to the savanna, perhaps one evolutionary pressure that would have favored bipedalism would be the fact that by standing upright, we would be able to see predators and prey at longer distances, and so avoiding predators and being able to catch prey more easily. So does that hold any water or not?
The problem with that explanation is that bipedalism appears to begin in a fairly forested habitat. And so if you're talking about the origins of bipedalism, you have to have some explanation that makes bipedalism selected for in that forested environment. And so, you know, that predation view over the landscape becomes much less likely in that environmental scenario. I mean, there's all kinds of things, from ideas about, you know, being able to carry food, being able to provision other individuals, you know, reducing the cost of moving between food patches. So walking bipedally is not more efficient than walking quadrupedally unless you do it in a very specific way with very extended hind limbs. So maybe if some of those things that made it slightly more cost effective, if resources were maybe getting a little bit farther apart and it became more cost effective to move on 2 feet instead of 4 feet because of those specific adaptations to walk bipedally in the way that it is more efficient, maybe that's an explanation. So yeah, I mean, there's a whole, you know, host of different ideas, some with more, you know, support than others, or some more supported, I guess, by the anthropological community than others. But yeah, isn't it funny that, like, the thing that makes a hominin, we can't explain why it is, right? It's like, it seems so fundamental, but yeah, but all of the ideas, I mean, I guess that's the process of science, right? Bring
Yeah.
ideas forward, evaluate them against the evidence. That one doesn't work, that one doesn't work. Okay. So,
Yeah, and I mean, of course, we have to test the several hypotheses out there, but I mean, sometimes I just think why would people push for just one sort of explanation? Couldn't it have been different sorts of evolutionary pressures at the same time pushing for bipedalism? I mean, it could be seeing predators at longer distances. It could be at the same time carrying objects for longer distances or something like that. I mean, why does it have to be one single explanation?
right. And, I think it's also the time depth over which we're talking is many millions of years, right?
Yeah,
I walked you through sort of this slow change in behavior. And so the impetus for bipedalism at the origins um,
right.
may
Yeah,
have been different from the selective pressures that selected for increasing efficiency or other aspects of bipedalism later on in hominin evolution. And I mean, certainly like the ideas about our endurance running capabilities and stuff like that would be things that would happen later in our evolutionary history. So yeah, so I think you're right. I mean, there doesn't have to be one reason why bipedalism was selected for over the entire evolutionary history. I think people are just very set on wanting to know the first, being the first or be is important.
yeah. I mean, we're all humans, and people get attached to their own pet theories, and they want to be right. Oh, this is the ultimate explanation, but many times that's not really the case. But by the way, just to put this out of the way, because since I published my interview with Robin Crompton, I got some people nagging me about that hypothesis. I think it's called the wading hypothesis or something like that. I mean, that people evolved bipedalism because they lived in the water or evolved in the water. I mean, is there any support for that or not?
Yeah, I'll say that I have not sort of followed that hypothesis in
Mm.
great detail. So the it's an appealing idea because we can see some analogs in modern apes when they're in a waterlogged area and they're either collecting food or carrying infants. They stand upright because they don't want to stick their face in the water. And so you can get a kind of nice visual of instances where that is a useful behavior, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it was occurring with enough frequency or provided enough of a fitness advantage to be the reason why bipedalism became selected for. And the fact that apes can behave in that way without any of the bipedal adaptations that humans show. It's like, what's the selective pressure if you're waist deep in water and the forces of gravity are not pulling on you in the same way, right? Because you have the buoyancy of the water, and so I don't know. That's not a very satisfactory answer because, as I said, I haven't been following the development of that idea with great detail. But I think there's questions about could it really be providing enough of a fitness advantage to be a selective pressure. Again, it depends on environmental reconstructions and how sort of ubiquitous those waterlogged soils are that hominins would have to move through. And also, if living apes can behave in that way without any of the sort of bipedal adaptations, then why does our anatomy look so different?
Yeah, I mean, when people talk about evolving in the water, what comes to my mind immediately is, yeah, but I mean, looking back into the kinds of environments we evolved in, did they have to move through water that much for it to
Right.
become a selective pressure? I mean, unless I'm ignorant in any way, it doesn't seem to me to be the case.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's exactly the point from my perspective is simply that how often are you in a, swampy swampy area waist deep while foraging? So, yeah, I don't know.
Right. By the way, when it comes to running, and particularly in humans, we have this thing that we can run for very long distances without getting as tired as other animals. For example, does our bipedalism facilitate that? I mean, if we were quadrupeds, for example, would it be harder, more metabolically costly, less efficient to do that?
Um, Humans are uniquely good at endurance running. We're not particularly fast, but we can run
Yeah.
for a very long time. Um, there are a lot of different factors that contribute to being that contribute to how long an animal can run. I mean, heat production is a big part of that. So if you're like a big horse and I mean, they have great endurance, right? They can run for a long time, but they're large and they're producing a lot of body heat, and they're not as good at losing body heat as
Hmm.
humans are because we're skinless and we're able to sweat so much and from all over our body. So part of reaching exhaustion is simply reaching a point at which you overheat. So that's one important way in which changes in human anatomy appear to facilitate endurance running. You know, we do our mode of running is very different from the mode of running of a quadruped, right? In terms of the biomechanics. I mean, we have a horse has a hoof that can make very quick contact with the ground, and most of their power comes from their hindquarters, whereas humans, we have multiple joints that are, your ankle in particular has to be engaged in that action of push off. So the mechanics of it are somewhat different, and you only have 2 feet producing force as opposed to 4 feet producing force. So I wouldn't say that it's like a yeah. So I guess quantifying, one is a better body for being efficient during long distance running than the other, but humans certainly it's somewhat unusual that a primate would be an endurance animal, and so the fact that humans seem to be able to do that is definitely interesting, and the fact that we have these adaptations like hairlessness and sweat glands all over our bodies, and an arch that allows us to works as sort of a spring mechanism, and our long Achilles tendon, which works as a spring mechanism for push off. All of those things seem to be related to that capacity for endurance running.
So when we compare ourselves to other bipedal animals and perhaps some bipedal primates that are not exclusively bipedal, but they are facultatively bipedal, let's say, I mean, is there anything unusual about us, for example, about our pelvises or something like that, that we wouldn't expect for a typical bipedal primate?
Well, we don't really have another primate to compare us to. So when other primates go into a bipedal posture, they tend to be they're in a more crouched posture. They are not able to extend their hips and knees in the same way that humans are. So they're a little bit crouched and a little bit leaning forward, and that takes more muscular effort to maintain that posture. So the fact that humans can fully extend the knee and fully extend the hip, and really, hold ourselves in a very straight posture means that at least during walking, we don't actually have to expend a ton of muscular energy to maintain that position and that posture. So that's one really big difference between the way in which a primate would walk on 2 feet, a different primate, we're of course primates, but another primate would walk on 2 feet and a human would walk on 2 feet. And, the other models for bipedalism in the animal world are, things like birds and kangaroos and, extinct dinosaurs and stuff like that. And their bipedal posture is really different. Again, tending to be much more flexed at the hips and the knees, but they have, some mechanism of counterbalance to kind of help, not make it all about muscular work to kind of keep their body upright. So, we're in this kind of weird situation where we don't have any good analogs to compare ourselves to because no other primates do what we do. So, yeah, it's maybe that contributes to our inability to find the perfect explanation for why we do what we do.
Well, maybe we'll have to go back to creationism. I don't know.
Yeah. I'm sure that's any better explanation.
Yeah. Okay, so talking specifically about the female pelvis, did our life history or the evolution of our life history influence the evolution of the female pelvis in Homo sapiens or not?
Yeah, so one of the major changes in human life history is, of course, our big brains, and when you have to have a big brain as an adult. I mean, I guess it doesn't mean that you have to be born with a big brain as an infant, but that's the way it works in humans, certainly. So human infants, neonates have very large brains, and that, of course, has significant potential to put selective pressures on the female pelvis because whatever size that baby is, it has to be able to fit through mom's pelvis. And humans do have sexually dimorphic pelvis. So the female pelvis tends to be, so there's two parts of the pelvis. There's that upper pelvis and that lower pelvis. The upper pelvis is not generally wider in females than it is in males. In fact, oftentimes the sort of breadth of the hip bones is a little bit wider in males because males on average are a little bit larger. But when you get down to the true pelvis and the part of the pelvis where the fetal head actually has to engage and make passage, that is generally wider and actually wider both front to back and side to side in females than it is in males. And so there's sort of three different planes that people talk about the infant having to pass through, and each one of those is expanded in women. And, one pretty obvious explanation for that would be that the large brains of human infants place selective pressure on the female pelvis, and it accommodated by becoming sexually dimorphic. And, that seems like a very reasonable hypothesis to me. So that change in simply having big brains very likely place direct selective pressure on the female pelvis to accommodate that big brained baby. And of course, having big brains has consequences for growth and development of the infants and, our whole life history trajectory that is so interesting.
Yeah. So in my question, I mentioned life history. I mean, I was perhaps trying to think about, so of course, I mentioned life history in the female pelvis, and in this case, I was trying to connect it, of course, to the size of our brains. But I was also thinking perhaps what's the relationship between or the steps that we have to follow for us to evolve bigger brains and then longer life histories. I mean, is it sort of a chicken and egg problem where selective pressures led to the evolution of our bigger brains, and then that allowed for longer life histories, or could it have been the other way around? Do we know anything about that?
No, I mean, that's a really good question. So, I mean, it is a little bit of chicken and egg, and in the classic telling, which is the telling of the idea of the obstetrical dilemma, is that, the pelvis becomes bipedal first, which is certainly clear, and then secondarily to that, larger brains start to evolve, and that is certainly well supported by the fossil record. And so because the pelvis was already sort of locked in for some aspects of bipedalism, It can accommodate to some extent those large brains of those neonates, but there's some problems, right? And this is the classic explanation for why human childbirth is so difficult. And of course, the other life history component to this is that humans not only, I mean, it really comes down to metabolism and energy. And humans invest a huge amount in growing those large babies, because not only do our babies have really large heads, they have really large bodies, but we actually have babies more frequently than other apes do. So we're able to we're able to decrease the time between infant births. And I'm sure you've followed to some extent the work of Herman Pontzer and his colleagues. He's sort of, the expert on the energetics of this. But humans seem to have evolved a metabolism to our total energy expenditure that is just well above the other apes. And that would help facilitate things like growing these really big brains and maintaining these really big brains, and closer spacing of offspring than we observe in other apes. Now, how you go to, fuel that higher total energy expenditure, again, is a big question. I mean, I think certainly probably the incorporation of meat is an important part of that in our evolutionary history. Probably the incorporation of food processing is part of that in our evolutionary history. Because if you evolve to have a higher total energy expenditure, then you have to fuel it, and you're at risk of starvation if you're not getting enough food or nutrients. So that the types of foods that humans needed along that evolutionary change probably differed from what was necessary before to grow a much smaller brain. So yeah, it's kind of a big circular question.
Yeah, and I mean, in that case, for example, things like fire and cooking would have come before the evolution of our big brains? Because, I mean, we have to have those sort of caloric input in place to be able to, to be able to keep up with these big brains, or is it something that could have happened again the other way around?
Well, the brains can't evolve in the absence of the means to facilitate them, but they can.
Sure.
The two things can kind of happen together, because it's not like brain size goes from 500 cc's to 1200 cc's in the matter of even 100,000. We're talking about a longer evolutionary trajectory. So
Sure.
the more high density caloric foods like meat become incorporated, and there was probably hunting, scavenging or hunting that happened first and helped to get protein rich food into the diet. But there are other food sources that are also calorically rich, which people have suggested as being important in allowing for that encephalization. And then as you start adding, additional food processing via cooking or other mechanisms to that, you sort of get this continual, increase in brain size and capacity to facilitate it, going like this as we move through time.
So, I mean, when it comes to the size of the female pelvis and the sort of complications we get from childbirth, I mean, how problematic from an evolutionary perspective is it really? Because, I mean, I hear from people that it seems that this was really a big deal, but I mean, at the same time, we're still here. So, I mean, I was just wondering, how problematic is it really?
Yeah, I mean, it really depends on the perspective from which you approach the question. And my experience is that we have a tendency to conflate difficulty during labor, meaning that it's just hard, like not a lot of fun to go through,
Yeah.
plus maternal mortality, which, we know is a serious problem. And we conflate those ideas into this evolutionary explanation. And really, the only thing that, this idea of the obstetrical dilemma being that there's sort of a competition between the size of the fetal head and the size of the pelvis, the only thing in terms of birth complication that can really speak to is obstructed labor. So it can speak to the idea of the head getting stuck or even the shoulders getting stuck, because we have, we have babies that are also large in body size and not just brain size. And so when we take the idea that birth is hard and maternal mortality, and we sort of take that big problem and attribute it all to only the one thing that sort of the pelvis versus head side evolutionary question can speak to, I think we're not asking the question properly. Because when you look at like the maternal mortality statistics, of course, it varies somewhat by region of the world, and there's questions about why it varies. But on average, globally, about 2.8% of maternal deaths are attributed to obstructed labor, the baby actually being stuck, and like well over 50% of maternal deaths are attributed to things like hemorrhage and sepsis. Mm-hmm. And so when we just push them all together and make it all an evolutionary explanation, we're missing actual major causes of maternal mortality that have nothing to do with the shape of the pelvis. So I don't know, I kind of forgot what your original question was. Sorry. I got on a
No, but that last point was a very good one. I mean, if you didn't mention it, I was just about to ask you, because I was wondering really if when we talk about maternal mortality during child labor, I mean, if the infant getting stuck basically was one of the major causes of maternal mortality, or if it were other causes. So
yeah. And so, I mean, part of the frustration is that it's very difficult to get clear numbers on this. So estimates can, I gave you the data point of 2.8%, and that's sort of based on a global analysis from data from the World Health Organization. But diagnosing obstructed labor during labor is not simple, and it tends to be diagnosed when labor is very prolonged. And certainly obstructed labor can be a cause of labor going on for forever, but there are other factors that can cause labor to be long as well. And depending on what sort of medical situation you are in, the interpretation of that changes, right? And so if you're in, one particular context, say like a, U.S. hospital, they have a timeline under which they think you should progress, right? And if you don't hit those timelines, there's a problem. Likewise, if you're in a different sort of culture surrounding birth, then the expectation may be that there's more variation in timing, and so there's more acceptance of the fact that it could take longer or not as long. And so at any rate, diagnosing obstructed labor could potentially be happening in situations where people don't necessarily have obstructed labor. I mean, I'm not an obstetrician, so I'm not telling anyone how to do their job. But I think part of the problem is that there haven't been any good studies that sort of work backwards. So say you have a cohort of women who, are diagnosed with obstruction or prolonged labor, they have C-sections. Could we work backwards and actually get some imaging of the pelvis and look at fetal size and try to figure out, was this really a case just absolutely can't fit? And of course, there's changes in the size of the fetal skull during birth, right? Because it can actually smush itself to fit. There's changes in the shape of the female pelvis, even with changes in body position. Now, how much those contribute to success versus not success, again, these are all open questions, and it's difficult to get really clean data on what is the exact frequency of obstructed labor. But it is certainly not the primary cause of maternal mortality, right? There are these other things like sepsis and hemorrhage and other things are dominant in terms of percentages of women dying from those causes. So.
Yeah, by the way, putting aside our modern medical devices and practices, because those are not relevant from an evolutionary perspective, is there any good field work on how perhaps traditional societies would have dealt with these sort of situations? I mean, could they have had some sort of practices or technologies to try to facilitate childbirth that perhaps would buffer some of those negative effects, or I mean, that would get expressed in terms of maternal mortality and perhaps infant mortality and so on?
I can't give you any great specifics. I can say that it is pretty much universal across cultures that women are assisted during birth, that they have someone there with them who, presumably has experience. In terms of mortality amongst, say like modern hunter-gatherers, I don't actually know that. I don't know the figures. Again, I'm sure, maternal and infant mortality certainly occurs, and maybe somewhat higher than, certainly in a situation where you had obstructed labor and you don't have access to a C-section, right? Yeah, that's a big problem. But knowing how much of that maternal mortality is directly related to fetal size and maternal pelvic size, I don't know how you get those data. So.
Right, fair enough. I was just trying to circle all the way back to my original question and perhaps reframe it now. So earlier I tried to ask you if really it was very problematic from an evolutionary perspective, this sort of mismatch between the size of infants' brains versus the size of the female pelvis in terms of childbirth. So, but I mean, strictly from an evolutionary perspective, could it have been the case that we would have evolved so big brains that they wouldn't be able to get through the canal, basically? And I don't know if this is even possible. I'm just thinking here,
no.
but that basically, in the extreme, we would have gone extinct or something like that.
Right. I think the best evidence for the fact that human childbirth generally works quite well is the fact that there are 7.9 billion people on the earth. And if it were in so many instances, again, and that's not to diminish the importance of, maternal mortality, which is really problematic, but without medical intervention, if the predominant number of women are unable to birth offspring, then yes, we are not here anymore. We're not here as a species. And that doesn't mean that obstructed labor never occurred in the past, but it didn't occur with the frequency. In other words, the sexual dimorphism that we see in the modern pelvis, and maybe also, cultural assistance through, support during labor, as well as maybe differences in position that labor can occur in, all of fetal molding of the skull, all of those things together must be sufficient for the predominant number of women to be able to give birth to offspring. Otherwise, yeah, we're no longer here.
Yeah, I was just wondering if that could have happened, because
it could have, but yeah, we wouldn't make it very long if all of a sudden babies' brains were so big that they just couldn't even, get out of the maternal body, unless we evolve some, like Alien, where they burst out of the belly, and that wouldn't leave very moms left, but it's maybe, sorry, that's horrible. I don't know why I thought that. That image just came right into my mind.
No problem, no problem. Okay, so I mean, because without dismissing perhaps the moral questions about infant and female suffering, of course, due to child labor and all of those sorts of things, because they are relevant, but I was just trying to understand strictly from a scientific and in this case evolutionary perspective, if perhaps when people say that it's a problem, it wasn't as problematic as people make it. I don't know, perhaps something like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's here's the anthropologist, coming out at me, and our biocultural approach, which is your interpretation of difficulty can never really be divorced from your sort of cultural viewpoint, right? And we've certainly been taught in the West, like every movie you've ever seen that has a childbirth scene has some woman, screaming her head off, telling her husband that she hates him. I mean, we have a cultural understanding of what this looks like, and I do think that contributes to the idea that there must be some scientific basis for childbirth difficulty. I've even been challenged by some of my grad students to say, don't call it childbirth difficulty, because the more you say it's difficult, you reinforce the idea. I mean, it's a natural process, right? Like, it's a natural process that has to occur. And that doesn't mean it's fun, but if it didn't work, then we wouldn't be here. Estimating how much pain or distress a cow is in during labor compared to a human, how do we rate that? How do we figure out who's having a more difficult time? I don't know. I mean, certainly it seems logical that if your baby is much smaller than the size of your pelvis and it takes less muscular effort and less energy and less stretching, then maybe that's a more pleasant experience. But again, it's not necessarily the experience that is the evolutionarily relevant question. It's just whether or not it happens successfully and both mother and infant are healthy and able to continue their sort of normal daily behavior once it's over.
Yeah, I mean, perhaps another thing to keep in mind here is that evolution by natural selection works with what's good enough. I mean, it's not really that evolution by natural selection would care about our suffering and existential misery or something like that.
Right. No, right. Absolutely. Absolutely. And yeah, I mean, and even working good enough for the predominant number of people, right? And so undoubtedly there have been, I mean, obviously we have lots of historical accounts of women dying during childbirth, and prior to our historical knowledge, certainly that was a cause of death as well. But again, if it works for the predominant number, then presumably the reasons why it doesn't go well, and sometimes the reasons why it doesn't go well have nothing to do with some adaptation of the pelvis or brain size, right? I mean, birth can go wrong for other reasons, so.
Yeah. So, I mean, moving from the female pelvis exclusively, I mean, what are some of the major sex differences in terms of the pelvis?
Yeah, so I mean, it is primarily those differences between the lower portion of the pelvis. So the upper portion of the pelvis, how wide those blades are tends to not be dimorphic between males and females, at least in terms of absolute measures. And even sometimes males are a little bit wider because they tend to have bigger bodies. But when you get down to the true pelvis, women are wider in sort of all of the plane. We talk about the pelvic inlet, which is the sort of circular part when you're looking down at the top of the pelvis, and that's the first plane that the baby has to pass through. And then there's the midplane, which is defined, at least in the side-to-side diameters, by these bony processes that stick in, called the ischial spines, and those are attachment sites for muscles of the pelvic, diaphragm muscles and ligaments that help support your guts. And then underneath that is the pelvic outlet, which is your sits bones, and that's sort of the final point of passage for the infant. And those also tend to be a little bit more flared outward in women than they are in men. And sort of average differences between males and females are, you know, a couple of centimeters greater in females than in males on average. So those are the major changes, is that there's just sort of this average size difference that also leads to some differences. Like, one of the ways you can pretty accurately tell the biological sex from just looking at a pelvis is you can look at the subpubic angle, which is, you know, at the front of the pelvis, the pubic bones come together here, and it tends to be more narrow in males and wider in females, and all of that just has to do with sort of widening the area of the birth canal.
But I mean, those differences, are they the result of selective pressures having to do with women bearing and having to deliver children and men not? Or are they the result of some, for example, sexual selection?
I mean, that's a super good question. They have always been interpreted as related to birth. There are some new ideas. So there's a couple different questions. One is selection on the female pelvis. The second can be selection on the male pelvis, right? And so the traditional interpretation has been that both males and females have to walk and run, right? But males can optimize for walking and running because they don't have to worry about this competing selective demand of giving birth. And so because females have to do both, that somehow locomotion is compromised because of that need to keep the true pelvis wider. Now that's, you know, the research that I've done and with colleagues demonstrating that that's not the case. As far as we can tell, there's no locomotor disadvantage to having a wider pelvis in the number of ways that we tested it.
Yeah,
so,
it's good that you say that, because I was just about to ask you if that would have some kind of implications in terms of why men and women differ in terms of their athletic abilities. But anyway, let's leave it at that.
Yeah, no, yeah. So, I mean, so that interpretation it was dominant for a long time, and some of the research that I did was basically demonstrating that there's no, you know, pound per pound, there's no cost difference between males and females during walking and running, and that the function of those all important hip abductor muscles that I talked about earlier, you know, is not impacted by the width of the pelvis alone. And so then the question can be, all right, if there are not negative consequences for a wider pelvis in females, how come males don't just have a wider true pelvis also? Is there some selective pressure acting on them to make their pelvis narrower? And one of the suggestions related to that has to do with supporting your viscera and your guts inside your body, because one of the problems you have when you become a biped is that instead of your guts sort of sitting on top of your abdominal cavity and, you know, supported in that way, all of a sudden they're sitting on top of a literal hole straight down to the ground, and you have to have something there to hold them in. And so those ischial spines, which I talked about a minute ago, which are the midplane of the pelvis, they are attachment sites for these ligaments and these muscles that are form your pelvic diaphragm, and it's that diaphragm that has to support your viscera on top of it. And so the fact that females have that opened a little bit more than males do, those ischial spines tend to stick into the pelvis more in males than they do in females, means that diaphragm may be slightly less strong in females than it is in males. And so that maybe could have a fitness consequence, you know, if it leads to organ prolapse, or your organs, moving beyond the pelvic support system. So that's one idea. And other ideas that people have been introducing relatively lately are that there is actual selection for a narrower pelvis in males, maybe having to do, one of the more recent papers suggests that maybe erectile function is, you know, works better if you have a slightly, those muscles work better if you have a slightly narrower pelvis. I mean, I don't know that there's any good data supporting that yet, but it's interesting to see new ideas coming online to look not just at selection on the female pelvis, but selection on the male pelvis as well. And then one thing I think that we need to explore more is the role of hormones in the development of dimorphism and pelvic shape, because in infancy and throughout childhood, you can't tell the difference between a male and female pelvis from a boy or from a girl. They look the same. And it is at puberty, with the initiation of that cascade of hormones, that you start to get the differentiation. And so is that cascade of hormones differentiating in a way predicted by natural selection, or are those differences a byproduct of that hormonal cascade that has to do with other aspects of reproduction? So all of those are open questions, ready for exploration.
That's very interesting. And but I mean, does it have anything to do in any way with sexual selection? I mean, because of perhaps the effects that a certain shape of the pelvis might have in other aspects of the female anatomy or something like that.
Yeah, like as a secondary sexual characteristic. Yeah, I mean, people have certainly suggested that. I think the problem with the studies that I've seen sort of, you know, claiming that there's a preference for broader hips or whatever. Number one, the visual broadness of an individual's hips is not just dictated by their bony anatomy, but by a lot of other aspects of anatomy as well, right? So if there were selection for some specific female body type, it wouldn't necessarily be on the skeleton. And second, ideas about appealing female body type are not necessarily universal, right? Different cultures have different ideas. I'm sure we've all seen these, you know, ridiculous things in our Facebook feeds or whatever about, you know, the ideal female body through time. And, you know, you walk through the 1850s, it changes, right? I mean, the idea of what is beautiful or appealing changes with cultures. And so I'm not super convinced that there's some selective that there's sexual selection acting on female shape in a specific way related to the pelvis that has to do with that. I mean, other secondary sexual characteristics, I think, you know, that makes good sense, but not necessarily the skeletal shape of the pelvis.
Yeah, I mean, I asked you that because I've had quite a few evolutionary psychologists on the show, and I mean, they don't have a definite answer to. I mean, it seems that there are some studies that point to the fact that it's a universal male preference that men tend to prefer that so-called hourglass figure. And I mean, then recently there have been some meta-analyses coming out that suggested a few hypotheses to explain that, and they mentioned, for example, fecundity and nubility and things like that. So I was wondering if, for example, in anthropology, you also have that sort of idea when it comes to mate preferences on the part of males, and if so, what would be the explanation?
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of a bit beyond my, you know, area of expertise for sure. But I think, I mean, I certainly have seen, you know, studies that refer to the idea that there is sort of a universal male preference. And like I said, if there is a universal male preference for some kind of hourglass shape, I would say it would be much more likely that is responding to things like fat deposits than it is skeletal shape that is dictating pelvic, you know, that is dictating the visual appearance. And I think there's a compelling case. I don't know in terms of mate selection, but there's a very compelling case that the reason humans are very good at putting on fat, where we have much more fat than any other ape does, and females tend to have, in fact, almost females on average have, probably like 5 to 7% more body fat than males do. And there's a very good argument that those fat stores have to do with this idea that we talked about before about total energy expenditure being so much higher in humans, and that facilitates big brains and shorter interbirth intervals and all of that. And that gives you some sort of fallback. I've heard people refer to it as like an extra battery, so that if you can't find food, you have some reserve, right? And so, I mean, could it be I'm going out on a limb here. I have no data to support this, but could it be that, somehow male preference towards females who have more fat deposits because, that's some kind of sign of fecundity? I mean, maybe, but I don't think it has anything to do with skeletal shape. I don't think, it's some vision into whether or not, women are going to be able to have babies successfully, through because of the shape of the pelvic canal. So I guess I'm skeptical of those explanations. I feel like, and again, this is a little outside of my wheelhouse, but in terms of explanations, my understanding is that a lot of evolutionary psychology relies somewhat heavily on this sort of males compete model for understanding human mating practices. And there are alternative models out there that suggest that both males and females are choosy about mates, and that has to do with the fact that both males and females invest very heavily in offspring. And because of that, there are probably signals going both ways, right, in terms of selection for various characteristics that have to do with investment in offspring. So as much, I guess, as I can say about that.
Yeah, I mean, just to be fair about that bit, because 3 years ago or so, perhaps 2 years ago, I've had Steve Stewart Williams on the show, who wrote the Ape that understood the universe, and we talked a little bit about that because he and Andrew Thomas, I think, wrote an article where they criticized the sort of males compete, females choose model of evolutionary psychology, and they proposed the mutual mate choice model. And I mean, I asked him directly if the males compete, females choose model was still very prevalent in evolutionary psychology, and he told me not so much anymore. So, I mean, I'm basically relying on what he said, but I mean, just to put that comment out there, because I interviewed him.
I'm very familiar with their paper, and that is exactly what I was referring to. But yeah, I am not up to date on my evolutionary psychology reading, so I completely trust that you are following the trend in that more carefully than I am.
Well, let's hope that I'm not embarrassing myself here. Okay, so I have a few more questions here. I think we haven't talked yet about the concept of human altriciality. So what is it, and what does it have to do with what we've been talking about?
So it has to do with the idea that human infants are born very helpless, and I mean, we all know that that's true, right? They are not capable of clinging to mom, and of course mom doesn't have fur, so they couldn't cling anyway, even if they could, but neurologically they're sort of considered underdeveloped. And the way in which that relates to female pelvic shape, or was classically thought to relate to female pelvic shape, is that when brains started to get bigger in our evolutionary history, there's a point at which they can't get any bigger and still be able to pass through the birth canal, and yet all this neurological development still has to happen. So the idea was that pregnancy kind of got truncated in order to make sure that the infant could still, pass out of the birth canal, and then there was this period of sort of fetal life during early development that was what should have happened during pregnancy, but couldn't happen during pregnancy because of the bipedal pelvis. And one of the classic bits of data that has been used to support that is this idea that when infants are born, they have only 30% of their total adult brain size, but like something like a chimpanzee has 40% of its total adult brain size. And so the recent work of Holly Dunsworth in the egg hypothesis paper that I was on with her and our co-authors push back against that idea that human pregnancy is truncated. And some of the data that we brought to bear on that was the idea that somehow human mothers are sort of under investing in pregnancy to keep the infant small. And if you make gestation length relative to what we would expect of a primate of our size, we actually have longer gestation lengths than you would expect of a primate of our body mass. If you make neonatal brain size relative to maternal body mass and say, what would we expect for a primate of our size? We're way off the chart, and apes are actually under what we would expect. So ape infants are actually born with less of their brain form than we would expect of a primate of their size. And humans, of course, are way above. And then similarly, body size is much greater in human infants than it is apes. It's sort of varies by ape, but but the takeaway point is that human mothers are actually investing a ton in growing a relatively large, relatively big-brained baby. And the fact that when we're born, we only have 30% of our adult brain size says more about the fact that we have such huge adult brains than it says about our brains being small at birth, right? Because it's a relative size. And so the idea that the altriciality of human young has to do with the truncation of pregnancy because we just can't have big babies, I think is fairly well disproved by those data, because we do have big babies relative to what we should have given any other primate. Mm-hmm. So.
Yeah, but in terms of the brain development that occurs after birth, I mean, could it be that we are born with brains that are not as mature as the brains of other primates, I mean, in comparison to them, because we live in the sort of societies where we have to acquire a lot of knowledge and do a lot of learning during our development, much more so than other primates? I mean, could it have something to do with that?
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. We have a long way to go to being sort of fully neurologically developed because we have such large brains, because the behavioral capacities that humans have to acquire. I mean, we also have very, very long childhood and juvenile period, right, compared to any other primate. And so all of that is definitely associated with the fact that we just have to take in an awful lot before we are sort of fully neurologically and behaviorally developed. So, that part is absolutely true. And so in terms of thinking about baby humans as helpless, that rings true. The question is, are they helpless because pregnancy can't last any longer, right? And that was the traditional explanation. But I don't think that is as clear.
Yeah. And I mean, perhaps there we would have a definite sex difference because male brains never fully mature in humans. So.
Not seeing a thing about that.
Okay, but I'm a man, so I can say that. I can say it. Okay. Okay, so another question. So I had a question here. Do rates of encephalization have anything to do with the timing of birth?
I mean, I don't I don't think so for the reason that I elaborated, which is simply that, you know, both brain size and body size in human neonates is very large compared to what we would expect for a primate of our size. And so I don't know, you know, I mean, that's a good question. I don't know exactly how you would piece this together in terms of thinking about what the length of pregnancy looked like over human evolution. Certainly, I would suspect that as more maternal investment has to be put into brain and body growth, that would elongate pregnancy. And as is demonstrated by the data that I just said, human pregnancy is longer than we would expect of a primate of our size, but sort of how that exactly ties to changes in encephalization in hominin evolution is probably really hard to know, because how do you measure pregnancy length in the fossil record? I sure haven't figured that one out. So yeah.
Yeah, fair enough. So perhaps just one last question. I mean, probably it will be my last one. Talking still about human altriciality, what is the metabolic hypothesis for human altriciality?
So, so the idea put forth in that paper by Holly Dunsworth and our co-authors was essentially that instead of pregnancy terminating because the baby gets too large to fit through the birth canal, instead of that being sort of the triggering mechanism, the triggering mechanism has to do with how much metabolic energy mom is able to sustain in order to stay pregnant. And we have a graph in that paper. If you look at the expected energy needs of the fetus relative to mom's total energy expenditure, people are able to sustain a daily totally energy expenditure that's somewhere around like 2 to 2.5 times their basal metabolic rate. And that ceiling of sort of between 2 and 2.5 is reached, I think it's about, sorry, I'm forgetting exactly, but somewhere around 7 to 8 months worth of gestation. And so as mothers hit that peak and level off and no longer can increase their total energy expenditure, but the infant's energy expenditure is quite low for a long time, but then all of a sudden starts to increase exponentially. There's a point at which that line crosses mom's total energy expenditure. And the idea behind the metabolic hypothesis, or the egg hypothesis, is that when that infant energy need outstrips the capability of mom is the point at which the pregnancy doesn't terminate, but labor begins. The baby can no longer be fueled inside the body, and then it needs to move outward. And so that's the idea. And I know that people are working on data to assess that in more detail, but that's sort of an alternative hypothesis to the idea that it's the size of the pelvis that is really dictating how long pregnancy is in humans.
But is there already good support for it?
Well, there's data in as much as we have some aggregate studies of doubly labeled water, and again, this research is in that 2012 paper, Dunsworth et al., but Herman Ponser, Tara Steeken, Peter Elliott, and myself. And I know Herman spent a lot of time sort of aggregating that doubly labeled water data on maternal pregnancy and sort of seeing how that charts out. But I think that's something that probably needs to be supplemented with more data. But the data that we have certainly supports that suggestion. So.
Okay, very well. So before we go, would you like to tell people where they can find your work on the internet?
Um, sure. Well, they can find my work by going to my faculty page at University of Colorado at Denver. I'm not, I don't have fancy Twitter handles or anything else. Sorry, I'm a Luddite. I guess I avoid the the Twitter arguments. So, but yeah, you can certainly find me on the CU Denver website and send me an email if you have questions.
Okay, great. So it was really fun to talk to you. Thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show.
Oh, thanks for having me. I appreciate it. Fun conversation.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you like what I'm doing, please consider supporting the channel. It's thanks to people like you that it keeps running, so I will leave links in the description box for PayPal and Patreon. Any amount, even just $1 per month, would already be a great help. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share the interview, leave a like, and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and supporters, Karen Litska, Anne Blanchett, Parerga Larson, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Ricardo Vladimir, Craig Healy, Adam Castle, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollesy, Enrique Alenia, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Vos, Bo Weingard, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Thomas Trumbull, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Columba, Jorge Pinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Michael Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Ugni, Alexander Dunbauer, Omari Hickson, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Al Herzog, Don Ross, Jonathan Librand, Oslin Bullitt, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Eden Solon, Romain Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Londoño Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostaszewski, Nelek Bach, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Al Ortiz, Guy Madison, Gary G. Elman, João Linhares, Lida Cosmides, Saima Afzal, Adrian Yegi, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Jules Price, Edward Hall. My producers, Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Tafinia, Kian Gilligan, Luís Caetano, Tom Vanagdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardas France, Nirban Balachandran, and my executive producers, Michel Rugieski, Rosie, James Pratt, Matthew Lavender, and Sergio Quadriano. Thank you for all.